In the last episode of this series, Ancient Egypt, Dynasty by Dynasty, we saw how Egypt reached the pinnacle of greatness, once again, under arguably its most famous pharaoh, Ramesses II. Barely a decade after his death, at least two of his descendants, Sethnakht II and the mysterious Amun, vied for control of the country and the vast empire attached to it, which weakened the central government and the writ of the pharaoh across the realm. The last ruler of the 19th dynasty was a queen named Tausret, who herself most likely usurped the throne from a mere teenage boy who had been made pharaoh perhaps as a compromise between the two factions loyal to the now dead Sethnakht II and Amun. Women rulers were controversial in conservative Egypt, and with the political turmoil within the ruling class, the country is said to have been in chaos. To the rescue, at least according to a few inscriptions and some papyri, was Sethnakht, whose name means, "The god Seth is victorious." How Sethnakht rose to power in a government dominated by the quarreling descendants of Ramesses II still isn't clear. From what we know, Sethnakht was a royal outsider, and this may have worked to his advantage. If he was a descendant of Ramesses II, then he made no effort to identify himself as such, and instead proclaimed that he had been chosen to rule by the gods themselves. Most of what we know about Sethnakht comes from two sources, a stela from Elephantine and a document known as the Great Harris Papyrus, which is the longest papyrus scroll ever to have been discovered in Egypt. The Elephantine stela is short on details, but it does state that those who opposed Sethnakht's kingship were defeated during the second year of his reign. Though the Great Harris Papyrus primarily deals with Sethnakht's son, Ramesses III, and his great deeds in honor of the gods, there are references to Sethnakht towards the end of the document that tell us the following. The land of Egypt was in the hands of chiefs and of rulers of towns. One slew his neighbor, great and small. Yarsu, a certain Syrian, was with them as chief. He set the whole land tributary to him. But when the gods inclined themselves to peace, to set the land in its right according to its accustomed manner, they established their son, who came forth from their limbs, to be ruler, son of Ra, Sethnakht. He set in order the entire land of Egypt. He cleansed the great throne of Egypt. He was ruler of the two lands. He established temples in possession of divine offerings, to offer to the gods according to their customary stipulations. Some scholars have made the case that Yarsu may have been the same person as Chancellor Bey, a high official of Syrian origin who was extremely influential during the reign of the boy king Siptah, who we met in the last chapter on Dynasty 19. In many ways, Sethnakht was not too different than Ramesses I of the 19th dynasty. Both were military men who had founded their own respective line of pharaohs. Both also already had a son to succeed them. And both men didn't live for very long after assuming power. Ramesses I ruled for less than 2 years, while Sethnakht was on Egypt's throne for no more than 18 months, if even that. When he died in 1184 BC, his son became the new pharaoh and took the name Ramesses III. The Great Harris Papyrus describes this event rather poetically. He, Sethnakht, appointed me to be hereditary prince. I was the great chief of the lands of Egypt, and commander of the whole land, united as one. He, Sethnakht, went to rest in his horizon, like the gods. Then my father, Amun-Ra, Lord of Gods, Ra-Atum, and Pitta, beautiful of face, crowned me as Lord of the two lands, on the throne of him who begat me. I received the office of my father with joy. The land rested and rejoiced in possession of peace, being joyful at seeing me as ruler. It had been nearly 30 years since any pharaoh had taken the throne name Ramesses, with the last ruler to have done so, Ramesses II, arguably being one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs ever. Ramesses III imitated his namesake in several ways. For example, he adopted many of the exact same royal titles. He also had many sons, at least 10, from his two principal wives, several of whom were appointed to high positions, which was very similar to what Ramesses II had done during his own reign. The third Ramesses also started a new mortuary temple complex at Medinet Habu near Thebes, which was, again, quite similar to that of Ramesses II's nearby. And soon, like the great commander of Kadesh, Ramesses III would fight his own epic battles, though the long-term results would differ considerably in comparison to those of Ramesses II. The first 4 years of Ramesses III's reign, at least in Egypt, were rather tranquil, with the new pharaoh further consolidating his family's hold on power. However, there was some trouble in the west. The Libyans, along with 2 other tribes, the Meshwesh and the Sepid, invaded parts of the western Nile Delta. The Egyptian army was more than a match for them, and those who weren't killed were taken as slaves. However, the Egyptians' ability to successfully deal with foreign threats would soon be put to the test. For reasons that even to this day are still not agreed upon by scholars, by the time that Ramesses III became pharaoh, something absolutely dreadful was occurring in the eastern Mediterranean and Aegean regions. While piracy had always existed, the current phenomenon seemed to cause much more death and destruction. Large bands of marauders weren't just simply raiding cities for plunder, but also burning them to the ground and mercilessly massacring their inhabitants. The regional hegemonic powers and their network of vassals seemed unable to check their advance and contain the violence. Such worrying news would have no doubt reached the court of Ramesses III during his early years as pharaoh, as such activities would have disrupted trade and the relative calm that had existed for decades throughout the eastern Mediterranean world. Correspondence between the rulers of the region seems to indicate that the first great urban center to fall may have been that of Ugarit, today located on the shores of western Syria. One letter from Ugarit's king to his higher-ranking counterpart on Cyprus tells the latter that the city's ships had been called to the area of Luca in southwestern Anatolia, while his troops and chariots were elsewhere in service of the Hittite king, possibly fighting against a faction of the same group that was at the time ravaging Ugarit's own lands. In the end, Ugarit could not sustain the damage being inflicted upon it, and by perhaps as early as 1190 BC was completely destroyed. The city was never rebuilt. The popular view today is that the mysterious and hostile forces that sacked Ugarit went on to devastate the cities of Kadesh, Alalak, Hamath, Qatna, and eventually bring about the downfall of the mighty Hittite Empire itself. The causes of this general phenomenon of death and destruction, which modern historians refer to as the Late Bronze Age collapse, has also been blamed for the downfall of the Mycenaean civilization that occupied the Greek mainland and the islands of the Aegean. As the threat moved southward into Egypt's sphere of influence, it devastated the cities of Akko, Lachish, Ashdod, and Ashkelon, and by 1179 BC, had moved closer to the traditional borders of Egypt. The exact origin and composition of the people who are believed to have devastated these and other areas of the Mediterranean world are to this day still a mystery, but modern scholars collectively call them the Sea Peoples, a term that became popular in the late 19th century and is based upon portrayals of them found in reliefs at Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. Ramesses III's own inscriptions at the site describing the events of his 8th year go as follows. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No one could stand before their arms. From Hatti, Kodi, Karkemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in one place in Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Peliset, Tijeker, Shekelesh, Danuna, and Weshesh, lands united. Pirates and other hostile groups from the Mediterranean were nothing new for the Egyptians, as they had dealt with them ever since their first trading expeditions had taken upon the high seas well over a millennium earlier. Members from some of these groups had even allied with Egypt's enemies, such as when the Shekelesh fought alongside the Libyans during the reign of the 19th dynasty pharaoh, Merenta. Others became mercenaries in the pharaoh's armies. Warriors from a people known as the Sherdin had also been members of the royal guard of Ramesses II. This time around, though, the number of different groups was much greater, and their reasons for attacking seemed to have been vastly different. Instead of heading east for plunder and profit, it appears that the majority of these Sea Peoples, as we'll continue to call them, had come to settle and plant firm roots into the new lands they were fighting their way into. Most scholars today believe that they were united by their desire to escape drought, famine, and other problems that were plaguing their homelands. While the reliefs upon the pylons of Medinet Habu depict seemingly countless battle-hardened warriors of all types, they also clearly show many who are women, children, and the elderly in ox carts. This didn't seem to be some state-sponsored campaign of conquest orchestrated by a powerful foreign adversary, but on the contrary, a ragtag group of several militias whose members consisted of the groups listed in the inscriptions of Ramesses III. Even before the current wave of destruction, and despite the country's political problems at home, Egypt had arguably still been the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, with the Hittite Empire reportedly falling to the Sea Peoples, it became the only one. Ramesses III's inscriptions seem to describe a coordinated attack by the Sea Peoples on two fronts. One massive force advanced by land through Canaan from the northeast, while another came by sea into the northern delta of the Nile. Ramesses III sent troop reinforcements to the main fortresses along the Egyptian border with Canaan, as well as prepared his ships for a naval assault, one that would be on his terms. The most prolific account of Egypt's battles against the Sea Peoples comes from the pylons of Ramesses III's own mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, and being that they were written for the gods, as well as posterity, one should season his words with a few grains of salt. Part of the inscription tells us, "Now, I was prepared and armed to trap them like wild fowl. I went forth, directing these marvelous things. I equipped my frontier in Zahi, prepared before them. The chiefs, the captains of infantry, the nobles, I caused to equip the mouths of the rivers like a strong wall, with warships, galleys, and barges. They were manned completely from bow to stern, with valiant warriors bearing their arms. Soldiers of all of Egypt, being like lions roaring upon the mountaintops. The charioteers were warriors, and all good officers, ready of hand. Their horses were quivering in their every limb, ready to crush the countries under their feet. I was the valiant Montu, stationed before them, that they might behold the hand-to-hand fighting of my arms. I, King Ramesses III, was made a far-striding hero, valiant to lead his army on the day of battle. Those who reached my borders, their seed is not. Their heart and soul are finished forever and ever. As for those who had assembled before them on the sea, the full flame was in their front, and a wall of metal upon the shore surrounded them. They were dragged, overturned, and laid low upon the beach, slain and made heaps from stern to bow of their galleys, while all their things were cast upon the water. Ramesses had set a trap for the sea peoples coming via the Mediterranean into northern Egypt by allowing the enemy to enter parts of the delta by ship so that his superior navy could ambush and annihilate them. Navigating the waters of the delta, especially the deeper south one got, could be tricky, but the admirals of the Egyptian fleet had the advantage of knowing the area much better than their opponents, such as where to hide their ships at key choke points for successful ambushes. As the Medinat Habu inscription states, the strategy was a resounding success. However, the details of the land battle are all but absent from the inscriptions, save for the fact that the Egyptians ultimately won the encounter, or perhaps series of encounters. Many scholars have asked the question as to why there is little mention of it in comparison to the sea campaign. One explanation is that perhaps Egyptian losses on the battlefield were simply too great to acknowledge. While the Egyptians' superior ships and expertise on the waters within their own country would have provided a huge advantage there, on land in Canaan they were much more vulnerable. By the time that Ramesses' forces may have encountered the sea peoples there, the battle-hardened warriors amongst their ranks had already acquired valuable combat experience fighting against the armies of the Hittites and the other more established states within Anatolia and the Levant, let alone defeating many of them. The Egyptian victory may have been due less to their superior technology and tactics, and more to the sea peoples overextending themselves in Canaan and the Levant, which may have made venturing further southwest towards Egypt too dangerous. The fact that Egypt ultimately lost control over many of their long-held Canaanite territories also implies that the aftermath of the land campaign did not achieve its desired results, or that the fighting had depleted the number of men they could feasibly use to control their imperial possessions. By 1170 BC, the threat of another great invasion, whether the Sea Peoples or other hostile force, seems to have subsided, and Ramesses III embarked on new building programs throughout Egypt. Ramesses created a new commission to inspect all of the major holy sanctuaries throughout the country, starting in the south at Elephantine and working its way up the Nile to the shores of the Mediterranean. These buildings were to be inspected for any needed repairs, while their priests and the rituals that they performed were scrutinized to make sure that the traditional religious rites and practices were being properly observed. Temple granaries and treasuries were also audited to make certain that state institutions were not being shortchanged and that corruption was weeded out. Based on the Commission's findings, each sanctuary was reconstructed or refurbished, and if necessary, its personnel modified. To support these and other projects, the government had to acquire resources from outside of Egypt, which had been made even more difficult due to the recent war with the Sea Peoples. Several territories that had once been vassals and tributaries of Egypt had now completely broken away, and Ramesses had to use force to bring some of them back into the fold, or at least to acquire the resources that his builders required. One of these was in the southern Canaanite kingdom of Edom, specifically a region called Timma, where valuable copper mines were located. The Great Harris Papyrus records an encounter with the Edomites, who, though they put up fierce resistance, were unable to withstand the Pharaoh's army. Other expeditions were sent to the Sinai for turquoise and to the fabled land of Punt for myrrh, incense, and other products sought by Egyptian temples for the pleasure of the gods. After nearly 2 decades on the throne, things were starting to look a lot better for Ramesses III in Egypt. He had fought at least 3 wars, including one against the Sea Peoples that had threatened Egypt's very existence, and had survived all of them. Egypt's bureaucracy and temple institutions had been strengthened and reorganized, which, at least in theory, created a more centralized government and thereby increased the power of the pharaoh. He had also re-established trade in a region that was just recovering from the ravages of war. On the surface, Ramesses III was beginning to look more and more like his great predecessor and namesake, Ramesses II. But all was not as it seemed. Ramesses III's inscriptions and documents such as the Great Harris Papyrus seem to omit much of the suffering that was increasingly affecting the population at large. While Egypt's treasuries and temples may have been stocked with copper, turquoise, and myrrh, its granaries were nearly empty. This, though, didn't stop the grand preparations for Ramesses III's 30-year Jubilee, also known as his first Sed Festival. After all that the country had gone through during the past 2 decades, Ramesses and his government probably thought that now was the time for a little pomp and pageantry. The Jubilee, though, couldn't have come at a worse time. Dating to around 1157 or 1156 BC, we have documentary evidence suggesting that things were going south for the average worker in Egypt. Well, not exactly the average worker, but the more elite ones who occupied the site today known as Deir el-Medina. Deir el-Medina, whose original name was Sethnakht, meaning place of truth, was a community located near the Valley of the Kings. Its residents were engaged in the many trades that were associated with the construction of royal and elite tombs, including the beautiful funerary objects intended to occupy them for eternity. Given the importance of their work to the top echelons of Egyptian society, they were also paid more than the average Egyptian state worker and lived in much better conditions. In fact, one could describe Deir el-Medina as a sort of ancient, gated community. Despite the town's vaulted status and the relatively high standard of living its citizens enjoyed, scholars believe the problems that affected workers here are somewhat representative of what was going on throughout the country, where the situation amongst the less documented, common people may have been even worse. Records from Deir el-Medina indicate that in the 29th year of Ramesses III's reign, the town's workers were not getting paid their monthly wages, which consisted mostly of grain and beer. First, they were 8 days late. Then, 20 days late. It's one thing not to get paid, but quite another not to be able to eat. One of Deir el-Medina's scribes, a man named Amun, went to the nearby mortuary temple of Pharaoh Horemheb to protest and demand action from local officials. An Ostrakhan discovered there, and now in Berlin, records the event. Year 29, second month of Akhet, day 21. On this day, the scribe, Emennacht, announced to the crew, saying, 20 days have passed in the month, and rations have not been given to us." He went to the temple of Horemheb in the estate of Amun. 46 bushels of emmer were brought, and was given to them on the 2nd month of Akhet, day 23. This, though, proved to be only a temporary solution. Several months later, payment to the workers was delayed by 18 days. On a document today known as the Turin Strike Papyrus, which is the first recorded instance of a workers' strike in history, we're told the following. Year 29, 2nd month of Peret, day 10. On this day, the crew passed the 5 guard posts of the necropolis area, saying, "We are hungry, for 18 days have already passed in this month." And they sat down at the rear of the temple of Thutmose III. Then the scribe of the enclosed tomb, the 2 foremen, the 2 deputies, and the 2 law enforcement officers came and shouted to them, "Go back!" The government seemingly did nothing to remedy the situation, as its current priorities revolved around one thing, or rather, one event: the Pharaoh's Jubilee. 2 days later, many of the workers staged another protest and walked to the Ramesseum, which was the great mortuary temple of Ramesses II. They spent the night at its entrance. Though much of this section of the Turin Strike Papyrus is damaged, the statements that the workers made to the officials survive, and are quoted as follows. "We have come here out of hunger and thirst. There is no more clothing, no more oil, no more fish, no more vegetables. Send word to the Pharaoh, our good lord, and send word to the vizier, our boss." Mention of the Pharaoh and the vizier must have unnerved the authorities in nearby Thebes, not just because they were focused on the Jubilee that was only a few months away, but also because escalating the conflict to their superiors would have made them appear to have been incompetent. And so, they gave in and provided the overdue rations from the previous month. 8 days later, the workers received the latest payment that was due to them. While satisfying the workers for the time being, it was again only a temporary solution to what had by now become a persistent problem. A few weeks later, the workers' scheduled rations failed to arrive yet again, and so another demonstration broke out. What happened immediately afterward is lost to us, but it appears that within 2 months, the royal vizier, Ta, arrived in Thebes, but was unable, or too afraid, to cross over to the western bank of the Nile to meet the protesters face to face. Instead, he sent them the following message. "Now, as for you saying, 'Do not take away our ration,' am I the vizier who was promoted in order to take away? Have I not given you what someone in my position would have accomplished? It so happens that there is nothing in the granaries. I will give you what I have found." The vizier's offer amounted to half the rations that were owed. This must have infuriated the workers even further, but the vizier was not in town to solve the rations and hunger problem, but simply to collect religious statues and other objects from various Theban temples for the great jubilee that was quickly approaching. One administrative document states, "The vizier Ta sailed north, after he had come to take the gods of the south for the said jubilee." The Turin Papyrus's final entry with regard to the strike, and dated to just 2 months before Ramesses III's jubilee, tells us how the mayor of Thebes also got involved in the delayed rations dispute, though it doesn't say whether or not the problem was finally resolved. Year 29, 1st month of Shemu, day 13. The workers left the necropolis grounds, saying, "We are hungry." They sat down at the rear of the temple of Merenta. They called out to the passing mayor of the city, who summoned Menefer, the gardener of the chief overseer of cattle, who told them that he would give them 50 sacks of emmer for their sustenance until Pharaoh gives rations. Whether or not the rations were actually given isn't stated, but Ramesses III's Great Jubilee Festival seems to have gone on in Memphis without any hindrance. The damage to the king's reputation, though, had already been done. In Egyptian society, at least in theory, the pharaoh and his government's obligation to the people was to provide order, security, and basic necessities such as food. But with Ramesses III and his administration failing to provide these things, the people's confidence in their leaders was shaken. We know of the workers of Deir el-Medina and their plight during this time due to documents such as the Turin strike papyrus. Though not documented in the same way, Egyptologists believe with almost certainty that other, less fortunate communities throughout Egypt suffered just as much or even more, thus fueling unrest throughout the country. It may have also inspired some within the pharaoh's inner circle to take advantage of the situation for their own gain. With at least 3 wives, several sons, daughters, and perhaps other children born of unnamed women, Ramesses III had a relatively large family. While normally this would be considered a blessing, as we've seen with past rulers, it could also be a curse, especially when jealousies and bitter rivalries developed amongst family members. Though the said Jubilee Festival may have shown the world that Ramesses III was full of life and vigor, the reality was probably the opposite. Many scholars believe that he was quite ill during the celebration. As heir to the throne, the pharaoh chose his eldest surviving son from his wife, Sethnakht, to succeed him as Ramesses IV. However, one of his secondary wives, Deir, wished for her son, who in later court documents is identified as Pentaweret, to become his father's successor instead. So much so that she apparently devised an elaborate plot to murder both the pharaoh and his heir apparent. The plan was quite complex and involved at least 38 people that included ladies within the royal harem, several of their relatives and associates, army officers, royal scribes, butlers, an overseer of the treasury, and even magicians who were supposed to use their knowledge of the occult to paralyze Queen Tiye's opponents. It's likely that the plot's complexity, as well as the numerous people involved in it, ultimately aided the authorities in catching the conspirators, but unfortunately, not before the pharaoh was killed. Recent CT scans of the mummy of Ramesses III indicate that he suffered what must have been a deep, fatal cut to his throat that reached into his spine. His heir, however, seems to have escaped unharmed, and in 1153 BC, he became Ramesses IV, the new pharaoh of Egypt. According to the court documents that make up what's today known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, a special tribunal made up of 12 judges was put together to gather information about the conspiracy and punish those who were guilty of plotting against the king and his rightful heir. 3 trials for the accused were held, with the leaders of the murderous plot found guilty and allowed to take their own lives, many of them within the courtroom itself. Perhaps even worse though, at least in Egyptian society, their names were hacked out from all monuments and changed in the official court records to something sinister. For example, the treasonous military commander, Qaim Waset, meaning arisen in Thebes, became Binem Waset, or evil in Thebes, while the butler, Merea, meaning beloved of Ra, became Mesetsura, or Ra hates him. Other, more minor conspirators may have escaped death, but were punished by having their ears and noses cut off. Prince Pentaweret, who may have simply been a pawn in the whole affair, was allowed to take his own life. The fate of his mother, the treasonous Ta, isn't recorded in the existing documents, but assuming that she was caught, most certainly would not have been allowed to live. Ramesses III was arguably the last great pharaoh of Egypt. He had defended the country against foreign enemies that could have destroyed it, and restored many of Egypt's religious institutions to their former glory. However, his reign was tainted by the loss of Egypt's empire in the Levant, as well as the countrywide economic problems that created discontent amongst much of the population. Within the first couple years of his reign, his successor, Ramesses IV, partook on an expedition to acquire valuable building stone from the quarries of Wadi Hammamat. The next year, he ordered another expedition of the site for the same purpose, but this time led by the high priest of Amun. It should be noted that quarrying stone was backbreaking manual work. A stela at the site claims that 9,268 men were assigned to the task, of which 900, or about 10%, are recorded to have died while working. Speaking of dying, Ramesses IV wished for his reign to be double that of Ramesses II, aka Ramesses the Great. In text on a stela discovered at Abydos, the fourth Ramesses beseeches the god Osiris to grant him an extremely long reign of 134 years. And thou shalt double for me the long duration, the prolonged reign of King Ramesses II. For more are the mighty deeds and benefactions which I do for thy house in order to supply thy divine offerings, in order to seek every excellent thing, every sort of benefaction to do them for thy sanctuary daily during these 4 years, than those things which King Ramesses II did for thee in his 67 years. His prayers, though, were not answered, for he died only 2 years later, reigning for a total of just 6 years. In 1147 BC, one of his sons succeeded him as Ramesses V. As the count of the number of rulers named Ramesses went up, the level of power and prestige that each one held plummeted. Ramesses V may have wished to reverse this, but the tide was now firmly against him, and several papyri discovered dating to his reign reflect this. One of these is known as the Wilbur Papyrus and dates to 1143 BC, the 4th year of his reign. At over 10 meters long, it's the largest non-funerary papyrus known to exist. The contents of the document include a major survey of a 90-mile stretch of land along the Nile River and the taxes collected from it. In short, the Wilbur Papyrus shows that the priesthood of Amun was the major benefactor of the tax revenue received, and not the government in Pi-Ramessa. As one would expect, more money meant more power and influence for the priests of Amun. Another indication of Ramesses V's weakness can be deduced from an ostracon dating to the reign of his successor, Ramesses VI. The text on the ostracon clearly states that Ramesses V, who is believed to have died from smallpox during his 4th year, was only buried in the tomb created for him during the 2nd year of Ramesses VI's reign. This is extremely odd, as Egyptian kings were generally laid to rest within 70 days of their death. Initially, some Egyptologists believed that the delay may have been due to some conflict between the two kings, as Ramesses VI was not the son or even the brother of Ramesses V, but likely an uncle. It's also agreed by most Egyptologists that Ramesses VI took over the tomb originally built for Ramesses V, had it renovated and expanded, and ultimately was laid to rest in it while his predecessor was buried in a much smaller one elsewhere. However, today, more and more Egyptologists are convinced that Ramesses V's burial was postponed not out of spite, but because of the fragile security situation created by Libyan raids on the cities of Upper Egypt, which would have made it extremely unsafe for work to continue on his original tomb. During the reign of Ramesses VI between 1143 to 1136 BC, Egypt's political and economic fortunes continued to decline. As Libyan raids intensified and spread further into the Egyptian heartland, troops were recalled from posts abroad, and whatever territory the pharaoh still held sway over in Canaan was gradually lost, not due to any military defeats, but simply because holding onto it was now proving to be nearly impossible. Egyptian extraction of copper and turquoise at the major mines and quarries also came to a halt. The next two kings, both named Ramesses, had very short reigns. Ramesses VII, son of Ramesses VI, ruled the 7 years between 1136 to 1129 BC. His uncle, another son of Ramesses III and his treasonous queen, Tia, became Ramesses VIII, but he ruled for no more than 3 years, with several Egyptologists believing it may have been less than 1. As the power and prestige of the ruling dynasty continued to fall, men from several families within the ranks of the priesthood and nobility swept in to fill up any political vacuums within their local precincts. None of them appear to have been more powerful than that of Ramesses, the high priest of Amun in Thebes. Ramesses had held his lofty and influential position since the reign of Ramesses III, and by the reign of Ramesses IX, he had become the de facto ruler of Thebes. Given that the land holdings and tax revenue that the priesthood of Amun controlled, it's not surprising that its leader would have amassed so much power and influence for himself and his family. Ramesses used this as leverage to ensure from the king that his sons would succeed him as high priest of Amun. One of them, named Amenhotep, even had an effigy of himself carved onto the walls of Karnak that was the same size and scale as that of the pharaoh, clearly making it known that he was no less than equal to the king. Part of the relief's accompanying inscription reads, "The king himself, he said to the princes and companions who were at his side, 'Give many favors and numerous rewards of fine gold, silver, and myriads of all good things to the high priest of Amun-Ra, Amenhotep, triumphant, because of the many excellent monuments which he has made in the house of Amun-Ra, king of gods.'" As for the king, this was now Ramesses IX, the grandson of Ramesses III through his son, Prince Montuher-Kopshef. Ramesses IX ruled for close to 2 decades, which was longer than his 2 immediate predecessors combined, but filled with just as many problems. Once again, Libyan marauders harassed Egypt's borders, and the common people suffered from soaring grain prices and the rampant corruption that pervaded the government and priesthood at all levels. In fact, it's during the latter part of the reign of Ramesses IX that the infamous royal tomb robbery trials took place. Tomb robberies in Egypt were nothing new and had occurred since prehistoric times. Those of royals and the elite were often filled with valuable grave goods, and this made them attractive targets for thieves. Tomb robberies were even more common during times of decline, unrest, and weak governance. The Egypt of the latter 20th dynasty had all of these in spades. Several papyri dating to the 16th and 17th years of Ramesses IX's reign detail investigations of alleged tomb robberies in the cemeteries along the west bank of the Nile River, including the royal cemetery of Dra Abu el-Naga, where the mummies of 17th dynasty kings and queens were laid to rest. Part of the reasons for the investigations may have been politically motivated and due to a power struggle between 2 Theban officials, Pazer, the mayor of the city's East Bank, and Pharaoh, the mayor of its West Bank, where the most important royal necropolises, including the Valley of the Kings, were located. Pazer claimed that various royal and elite tombs of the nobility in western Thebes had been robbed, but when a team of high court officials was sent to investigate them, they found that most were still intact. Only one royal tomb, that of the 17th Dynasty king Ramesses II, had been violated, although it was true that several tombs of lesser status individuals had been broken into. That said, many scholars who examined the papyri related to the case believe that Pharaoh may have been complicit in, or at least turned a blind eye, to the thefts. One manuscript dating to Ramesses IX's 16th year contains the testimony of Amun Panufar, a stonemason who described how he and 7 accomplices robbed the tomb of King Ramesses II. "We collected the gold that we found on the mummy of this august god, together with his amulets and jewels that were at his neck, and on the coffin in which he reposed. We found the queen in exactly the same state, and we collected all that we found on her likeness and then set fire to their coffins. We took their funerary equipment, which we found with them, namely vessels of gold, silver, and bronze, and we divided them up amongst ourselves." The last 2 kings of the 20th dynasty, Ramesses X and Ramesses XI, are also among its most mysterious. Very little is known about Ramesses X, including his relationship to his predecessor. Was he his son, brother, uncle, or someone else entirely? There's still no conclusive evidence to determine this. Records, though, show that he ruled for either 3 or 9 years. As I've mostly been using Ian Shaw's numbers, we'll stick to the years 1108 to 1099 BC. Like those of his predecessors, his reign was also plagued with rampant corruption, high inflation, attacks from hostile Libyans, famines, including one year described as the year of the hyenas when one was hungry, and the increasing power and influence of the priesthood of Amun at the pharaoh's expense. Ramesses X was succeeded by Ramesses XI, the last of the Ramesside pharaohs. Like Ramesses X, Ramesses XI's relationship to his predecessor has also not been firmly established. By his reign, the central government in Pi-Ramessa had all but lost its hold on Thebes. Amongst the common population, Ramesses XI was still recognized countrywide as the ultimate authority in the land, but in practice, his influence gradually evaporated or became non-existent the further south that one got. Of all the sanctuaries belonging to the god Amun, the greatest was his massive temple complex at Karnak in Thebes. This institution was the largest landholder in the region, and perhaps even the country. It employed thousands of tenant farmers and hundreds of artisans. It also controlled a large network of granaries. As the ability of the central government to take care of its people declined further with each new pharaoh, the people of Thebes and Upper Egypt became increasingly reliant on such temple institutions, whose leaders used their vast array of resources to make up for any services that the pharaoh couldn't provide. No one benefited more from the current situation than members of the Ramesses family, especially the current high priest of Amun, Amenhotep. As things got worse in Thebes, the people who were starving and growing increasingly destitute took their anger out on Amenhotep and the institution that he led. What happened next is really confusing and based upon how one interprets the fragmentary documents and inscriptions that Egyptologists have uncovered so far. There are several narratives for the series of events known as the War Against the High Priest, but the most agreed upon one goes something like this. Due to his unpopularity and inability to alleviate the sufferings of the people of Thebes, Amenhotep, the high priest of Amun, was forcibly removed from his position by a civilian mob, who appointed one of their own to take his place. For 8 to 9 months, Amenhotep was essentially under house arrest, either voluntarily or forcibly by the so far unnamed man who replaced him. With no other way to take back his position, Amenhotep finally petitioned Ramesses XI to reinstate him as the high priest of Amun. Ramesses was open to the idea, but it was not without risk. The unnamed usurper had fortified himself and his staunchest supporters at Medinet Habu, and it would take a considerable number of troops to dislodge them. And so, he sent the viceroy of Kush, Panesi, with Nubian troops into Thebes to restore order and deal with the usurper, which he seems to have done successfully. Shortly afterward, though, Panesi's men seized the city's main granary, which put him into conflict with Amenhotep, since the facility was technically the property of Amun and his priests. Due to the countrywide food shortage, whoever controlled Thebes' granary effectively controlled the city. With Panesi now the most powerful man in Thebes, Amenhotep and his followers took shelter in Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. When Ramesses XI found out about what was going on, he sent his general, Herihor, to reassert his authority in Thebes and possibly save Amenhotep. However, it was clear that Thebes' inhabitants were no fans of Amenhotep, and so Panesi saw himself as being the city's true leader and decided to stay, permanently. Soon, though, Herihor arrived with an army from the king, and a short civil war broke out that ended with Herihor chasing Panesi back to Nubia. Herihor then declared himself to be both a vizier and the new high priest of Amun, and with control of a large portion of the pharaoh's army, he became Thebes' new ruler. While initially acknowledging the pharaoh as the region's overlord, as time went on, Herihor increasingly ignored the writ of Ramesses XI, who was unable to do much to reassert his authority in the south. Herihor even adopted royal titles for himself, though these were only recognized within Thebes. A new calendar was also devised, starting from what was known as the beginning of the era of restoration, or Renaissance. In other words, the year that Herihor took over. Perhaps to avoid another civil war, Ramesses XI may have come to an unofficial agreement with Herihor, allowing him to keep his new positions, such as High Priest of Amun, and being the de facto ruler of Thebes and some of the surrounding areas, while he was officially recognized as Pharaoh. Whether that recognition translated into actual power is another matter. In 1069 BC, Ramesses XI died, seemingly without a direct male heir to the throne. Scholars are again at an impasse with regard to what exactly happened next, but evidence indicates that a man named Nespa-neb-Jadet took over the country, at least in Lower Egypt. Most also agree that Nespa-neb-Jadet was an army man married to Ramesses XI's daughter, which may have made his succession the most logical choice. Some scholars believe that he may have also had some relation to Herihor. Regardless, Nespa-neb-Jadet, better known by his Greek name Smendes, became the king in Lower Egypt and moved the capital to the city of Tanis, just north of Pi Ramessa, the latter which was eventually abandoned due to its local branch of the Nile effectively silting up. It's with the death of Ramesses XI and the ascension of Smendes as ruler of what had now in practice become a politically divided Egypt that the New Kingdom period of Egyptian history officially comes to an end. Smendes is credited with being the first pharaoh of Egypt's 21st dynasty, but his actual power, and those of his successors, was confined to mostly Lower Egypt and some territory just south of the city of Memphis. The rest of the country was in all but name under the control of the priests of Amun in Thebes, who, though they made no official break with the pharaoh in the north, were essentially independent of the government in Tanis. The two polities would exist side by side without much conflict, but soon, powerful families in other parts of the country began to break away to create their own little fiefdoms. Nubia also slipped away. For the third time in recorded history, the once unified country of Egypt was politically divided up into various kingdoms, ushering in what we today refer to as the Third Intermediate Period. More on that in the next episode of Ancient Egypt, Dynasty by Dynasty. Stay tuned. Thanks so much for watching. I'd also really like to thank the channel's patrons for making videos like this possible. These include, but are certainly not limited to, Grandkek69, Yap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Daniel Allen, Danny Van Eck, Wanix TV, Robert Morgan, Strobex, Frank, Tim Lane, Sebastian Otaro Correa, Michael Trudell, Leader Titan, Micah G, John Scarberry, Andrew Bomer, Krish, David R, Stephen Ball, Gabe, Monty Grimes, Franz Robbins, Cyrus Meir, Dianastra, Nimrod Nir, Hypno San, Brendan Redman, James Higley, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Darawala, Anahita Debu, Gulistan Debu, Sher Kam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, X, formerly known as Twitter, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.